then I will go ahead and share my screen. And hang on just a second. All right.
All right. Looks great on my end. If you have any trouble, just feel free to come off mute or raise your hand or something if you can't see something. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This informational webinar today is focused on reservoir operator requirements that are described in the water quality management plans of the 2025 Willamette Subbasin Temperature TMDL and the 2024 Lower Columbia Sandy Temperature TMDL. Before we get into today's topic, I wanted to highlight some of the webinar functions. Great, so go ahead and make sure your microphone is muted and feel free to use the chat for questions, or you can raise your hand. We're going to have a set time at the end of the presentation for questions. And as Grace mentioned at the top, we are recording this webinar and we will be posting it to our website. But if you need copies of the presentation before then, please reach out to your basin coordinator. So briefly, just wanted to go over our agenda for today. We're going to have a short introduction to TMDLs. Most everyone is familiar with them, but we'll just give a quick introduction. We'll then go into the requirements for dam and reservoir operators, and we're hoping to leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to take a couple minutes to provide some big picture context for today's webinar. We realize that many of the folks here are implementing a total maximum daily load for the first time, and we hope this context will help answer questions about why the DEQ regulates reservoir temperatures. To do this, I'll take you on a very abbreviated tour of Oregon's Clean Water Act regulatory framework. The process begins up at the top of the slide in the big green box with establishing water quality standards, something that involves two parts: designating uses and associating water quality criteria to those uses. Designating uses for a water body is just what the name says. It's the uses a water body should be clean enough to support, regardless of its current condition. These uses might include swimming, fishing, drinking water, and industrial uses. In turn, those uses inform water quality standards that will facilitate those uses. Other than temperature, examples of standards we set include concentrations of bacteria, mercury, and dissolved oxygen. The Clean Water Act applies these standards to waters of the United States, which includes a mix of navigable and interstate surface waters, such as streams, rivers, lakes, estuaries, and their tributaries. Next slide, please. After we set standards, we have to monitor, basically sample water bodies, analyze those samples, and compare results to those standards. In many cases, the DEQ goes into the field and directly tests water samples, as in the lower left photo. We also do this remotely, as is shown in the photo on the lower right. Following this flowchart to the left, we see that when monitoring tells us a water body does not meet standards, it is placed onto the 303D list, named for the section of the Clean Water Act that requires states to produce the list. Water bodies on that list don't meet one or more of the applicable water quality standards. Following the flowchart to the right, some water bodies are going to meet standards, and when that's the case, we don't have the authority to issue a TMDL. Unfortunately, that's not where we are right now with water temperature in the Willamette Basin. Oregon streams contain a lot of fish that evolved to require cold, highly oxygenated oxygenated water. That means we don't have to add a lot of heat to have a high number of water bodies on the 303D list. Once a water body is on this list, our state must take action to restore them and meet water quality standards and ultimately end up on the right side of this flowchart. That's where we are here and now on the left side of the flowchart. We know that Oregon has lakes and streams listed as impaired. The DEQ is required to form budgets and allocate that pollution among the known sources. That process, quantifying existing pollutant loads and calculating the load reductions needed to meet standards, is the total maximum daily load, or TMDL. A TMDL describes the rate you can add pollution to a water body and still meet standards. TMDLs are reviewed by the EPA before they are issued. I've just described the budgeting part shown in the lower left portion of the slide, but how do we stay within that budget? The plan for doing that is called a water quality management plan, which describes the management activities that will lead to meeting water quality standards. Responsibility is divvied out among managing agencies and responsible persons. What I've shown you now completes the loop. This is the framework Oregon and every other state uses to meet water quality standards. Hopefully we can all appreciate that this is an iterative process and it may take many cycles to achieve its goal. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. So we're now going to outline the specific requirements in the water quality management plans for the Willamette and Lower Columbia Sandy TMDLs for reservoir operators. Management and operation of dams and reservoirs is needed to minimize temperature warming and achieve TMDL allocations. All dam and reservoir operators named in Table 7 for the Willamette and Table 9 for the Lower Columbia Sandy in the water quality management plans must submit an implementation plan that addresses the monitoring and assessment requirements, which we will talk more about in a moment. Dam and reservoir operators that have jurisdiction over streamside areas must also develop a TMDL implementation plan to implement streamside management strategies. We wanted to highlight the important deadlines that are named in the water quality management plans. Plans addressing monitoring and assessment requirements for each reservoir identified in the water quality management plans are due on November 9th, 2026. This is the same deadline as for updated implementation plans addressing the temperature replacement TMDL requirements for lands that are owned or managed by identified DMAs. The deadline for the cumulative effects analysis or updated TMDL implementation plan based on the temperature assessment will be determined in consultation with DEQ. Some reservoir operators must also submit a streamside evaluation that must be completed by May 9th, 2028. This is required if you manage the land around the reservoir, but make sure to check in with your basin coordinator for specifics about your sites. So DEQ is focusing on implementation requirements for utilities and publicly owned reservoirs. Here is a list of large dam and reservoir owners responsible for monitoring named in the water quality management plans. Table 7 for the Willamette and Table 9 for the Lower Columbia Sandy. We recognize that each dam and reservoir is unique and will have specific issues. We encourage you to work with your basin coordinator about your specific circumstances.
All right, now I'm going to go over a little more background from the TMDL documents. Dam and reservoir operations were assigned a thermal load allocation in this TMDL. The load allocations are all presented in the TMDL document and are 0 for most dams. Assigning allocations is how we define the amount of a pollutant that can be added to a water body and still meet water quality standards, as Brian described earlier. What's most important for us today is that DEQ is applying what we call a surrogate measure for reservoir operations to implement the load allocation. The surrogate measure states that reservoir operators must release temperatures that are less than or equal to the 7-day average daily maximum temperatures immediately upstream of the reservoir. We're using a surrogate measure because monitoring stream temperatures rather than thermal load is more meaningful for reservoir management and is easier to interpret. The compliance point for the surrogate measure is just downstream of where the impounded water is returned to the free-flowing stream, and this measure applies during the TMDL critical period, which is also listed in the TMDL document. Generally, the critical period covers May through October, but it's longer or shorter for specific water bodies, so you should look at the table to see what applies to your location. Reservoir operators may also account for warming that would occur over the affected stream reaches in the absence of the dam using a mechanistic or empirical model. And if you're interested in using this approach, you should reach out to DEQ to talk about how to set it up. And I want to note also that we are not expecting immediate compliance with this surrogate measure. Operators are beginning by monitoring only to assess baseline conditions, and similar to other TMDL implementation work, DMAs will be expected to demonstrate incremental progress within their authority over time. I also want to note that some reservoir operators here already work with DEQ through our 401 Water Quality Certification Program, and so I wanted to make sure to clarify that for those operators, the monitoring requirements we're discussing today don't alter or replace any responsibilities that are included in your 401 Water Quality Certification. Monitoring requirements, where they're present in the 401 program, are focused directly on meeting the state water quality standards, and the monitoring requirements that we're presenting on today are related to the temperature replacement TMDL and specific to the language included in the Water Quality Management Plan. Also, if you're already conducting some temperature monitoring at your reservoir that's either related to DEQ's 401 program or another state or federal program, and you'd like to use some of your existing monitoring locations, plans, or data to fulfill some of the requirements of the TMDL, you should reach out to your basin coordinator to talk about whether or not they might apply to these specific TMDL requirements. And I'll hand it back to Brian.
Thanks, Grace. The Water Quality Management Plan has some specific monitoring requirements, and those are listed in section 5.3.7.1 of the plan. Again, the goal here is to characterize temperature dynamics in your reservoirs so that eventually best management practices can be put into place to lessen, prevent, or offset any temperature increases that might occur. In the next few slides, I will review some of the data and analysis needed to characterize these dynamics. We realize that some of you may already collect some or all of these data. Next slide, please. First off, inflow temperatures. These can be calculated in a variety of ways. Obviously, when you have a run-of-river type reservoir, as is shown in the image on the left, it's a simple task to measure temperature at two locations, the inflow and the outflow. However, I'm sure we're all aware that other reservoirs will have multiple inflowing streams. In those cases, inflowing water temperatures will need to be measured at more than one location. The inflow temperatures are then apportioned relative to the volume of these inflowing sources using flow-weighted averaging as described in this equation. Next slide, please. Temperature profiles. You will be required to collect temperature profiles for reservoirs to characterize any stratification that exists. The figure on the right is just a diagram of a stratified reservoir. We have the cold, dense water at the bottom layer, shown in blue, and warmer water on the surface, shown in red. Since we're implementing a temperature TMDL, managing the release of water from these different outflow depths will be an important feature of future implementation plans. Moreover, information about stratification allows us to approximate the volume of water in each layer. This is why characterizing stratification is so important. Depending on a reservoir size, depth, and other factors, many reservoirs are important sources of cold water throughout the summer. Temperature profile data collection does not need to be continuous to adequately characterize stratification. We also realize that stratification may not develop in some smaller reservoirs with short retention times. Next slide, please. Moving on now to inflow and outflow rates. By their very nature, most reservoirs store water for release during times of the year when stream flows are low. Because of this, reservoirs can be important sources of water for downstream reaches during some critical periods. In this hydrograph from Dorena Lake Dam, we see that inflow, represented by the light blue line on the bottom part of the graph, is really quite low during this time period, staying well below 100 CFS most of the time, except when these two storms move through that are shown by the peaks in the graph. By contrast, reservoir outflow, represented by the darker purple line, is well above 300 CFS for most of this time period, even hovering around 700 to 800 CFS for days at a time. Next slide, please. When collecting all of this monitoring data, it's important to follow a standardized procedure. Doing so ensures that data quality standards are met, meaning that we have high confidence that the data accurately characterizes the reservoir conditions. We realize that writing one of these plans from scratch can take a lot of time and resources. That's why we will make available a template document which can be customized and used to guide this data collection. If you are interested in using a template, please contact your basin coordinator for a copy. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more detail about collecting data under a sampling and analysis plan. Again, we're looking to document all aspects of the monitoring, starting with locations. Data storage will need to be described, whether it's done by hand or electronically. As a former data steward, one of the things I'll emphasize is quality control. For temperature, measurement has to be within 0.5 degrees Celsius using an approved thermometer, and be taken both before and after probe deployment. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that without both of these measurements, the data doesn't pass quality control and therefore cannot be used by the DEQ. Of course, each DMA has the option of developing their own sampling and analysis plan. The DEQ template is mainly for those who want a streamlined process. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Grace.
Okay, so just again in summary, you'll be required to submit your implementation plan, which addresses monitoring and assessment requirements on November 9th, 2026. After submitting that plan, operators will be expected to submit a report annually to DEQ, which describes the monitoring data collection during the TMDL critical period over the previous year, including those continuous inflow and outflow temperature measurements, temperature profiles, and water level fluctuations and outflow rates. The report should also confirm that data has been submitted to DEQ for upload to Aquams or submitted to another publicly available database. The purpose of the annual report is to briefly compare inflow and outflow temperatures to assess whether current discharges meet the TMDL surrogate measure and to establish baseline conditions annually and interannually for these reservoirs. After 4 years of data collection and assessment, operators will submit a report that identifies any opportunities to adjust operations to mitigate exceedances of the surrogate measure, as well as constraints that might preclude them from meeting the surrogate measure, such as other authorized purposes, requirements, or structural limitations. And if monitoring and assessment show that dam operations contribute additional warming above upstream temperatures entering the reservoir, then the operator can choose to either complete a cumulative effects analysis that demonstrates that releasing waters warmer than the surrogate measure would not contribute to downstream exceedances of water quality standards, or update their TMDL implementation plan to include structural and operational strategies to mitigate the temperature exceedances that they've identified. Like we've mentioned, we've compiled some resources to support both the development of your monitoring plan and your subsequent reporting on the data collected. The key documents that we're creating in coordination with our lab staff, key document is a template sampling and analysis plan. Like Brian discussed, it will include key components that we would expect to see for planning and implementation of these monitoring requirements. The template includes many references to DEQ standard operating procedures for continuous temperature data collection, as well as the EPA Field Operations Manual for profile sampling. And if you're starting from scratch, I would highly recommend that you begin with this template plan and work closely with your assigned basin coordinator to develop any further details that are specific to your monitoring locations and needs. DEQ lab staff also created some Excel document templates that we recommend using to ensure your data is formatted correctly for submission to our state water quality database, AQUIMS. And I want to note this is the first time we're working directly on monitoring requirements of this kind, especially with municipal operators. And so we anticipate that each of you will have specific questions and needs that are related to your reservoir and circumstances. And so we'll work with you in coordination with our lab staff and our water quality analysts to address those specific scenarios and considerations. But for today, we can go ahead and move on to a question and answer session on this presentation and the requirements of the Water Quality Management Plan. And for that, I will stop sharing and stop our recording.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Grace. So if anyone